Christian parenting.
This is Cynthia Yanoff, and you're listening to Pardon the Mess. Each week we have honest discussions about the ups and downs of parenting and the lessons God is teaching us along the way. It's real, it's fun, and it's biblical. Life is messy. Don't walk the parenting road alone. Hey guys, it's Cynthia. Welcome to Pardon the Mess. I'm glad you are with us today. We have Dr. Kara Powell with us, and she has written a book with Dr. Chap Clark called Sticky Faith. It's everyday ideas to build lasting faith in your kids. And I know everyone listening to this feels the way I do. Of all the things we're doing for our kids, the most important that we want to do is just make sure that they love the Lord and they know the Lord, and that they will raise the next generation of the church in their own homes someday. And so this whole concept of sticky faith, and I read that and I thought, ooh, I wish I would have thought of that term. But the whole idea behind that of doing the things now that will hopefully help our kids have a lasting relationship with the Lord, that's what today's conversation is all about. And obviously there's no guarantee what our kids will do. They are free-willed humans and individuals, and so we know that only the Lord can really speak into their lives. But there are some practical things that the research and the studies show help our kids have a lasting faith and a sticky faith. And so we're going to talk about those things today. Some conversations we can have, some people we can place in their lives. So you're going to enjoy this. It's practical, it's good, it's encouraging. So glad you're here with us with Dr. Powell, Sticky Faith. Hey, Kara, welcome to Pardon the Mess. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's great to be with you.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. And I'm just going to kick this off just right out of the chute and say, you threw out a statistic that I've read in your book that's a little scary, but we all think about. And it says 40 to 50% of kids who graduate from a church or college youth group will fail to stick with their faith in college. And that's a scary, scary thing. And we're not here to scare people to death, but if that's the reality, let's talk through it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you wrote a book talking about having a sticky faith. And you wrote it with also Dr. Chap Clark, but we have you and we're thrilled about that. And a sticky faith is such a great way to say it. But talk to us first. Let's just define what we're talking about. What is a sticky faith?
Yeah. Well, I would say sticky faith is a faith that lasts and that isn't only based on external behaviors. It might be manifested in external behaviors, but it's really about a person, or in this context, a young person's commitment to Jesus. One of the ways that we like to define discipleship is that it's your everyday yes to Jesus. And so a young person who is saying yes to Jesus every day, internally as well as in their external behaviors and choices, that's the kind of faith that we want to see last in young people.
Yeah. And so as I was kind of glancing through the book and reading portions of it and thinking through this, one of my main prayers for my kids, and I think anybody listening to this feels the same way, but we just want our kids to know the Lord, to
Yeah.
really know him and come out on the other side and to love him. And so when you think about this sticky faith concept and the things as parents we could do, knowing the realities of so many kids do leave our house and they don't stick with the faith. And so as I was looking at that, it was equally challenging to me on all levels of my kids. And for those of you listening, I think you'll find the same thing. I have a preschooler, and with that one, I'm like, okay, what are the things I can implement now to really do this well for him? And then I have a middle schooler and a high schooler, especially my high schooler who's leaving. It's her senior year this year. So I have another year. I'm like, what have we missed? Can we implement now? And so I think that's the beauty of it coming in wherever you are. There's places that we could just be intentional, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, to your point, our kids are now 19, 17, and 14, but our youngest, Jessica, was 6 when we started unearthing the principles of sticky faith. And it changed the way Dave and I parented her at age 6. We say it's never too late, nor is it too early to start thinking about how to implement these sticky faith principles. And I got to say, Cynthia, the way that I interacted with my 17-year-old in the last half hour was different because of our research. So every day I parent differently, and I think a whole lot better because of what we learned over these multiple studies, but especially studying over 500 youth group graduates during their first 3 years in college. I used to say 500 youth group graduates through their junior year of college, but as we know for college students today, first 3 year and junior year, not always the same thing. And
Yeah.
so we learn so much that can have immediate ramifications for you as a parent, step parent, guardian, grandparent, whatever age your kids are.
Yeah, yeah, that's so encouraging. And so I think for many of us, we've all heard this 1,000 times, and I don't know that any of us subscribe to the fact that we think it's the church's job to teach our kids about the faith, or the private school or wherever it may be. I don't know that many of us think that's actually the case, but we also, I think, sometimes underestimate how much influence we have as the parent. And so your research and what you talk about really underscores that. And so talk to us about how important it is, our role as parents in our kids, and the sticky faith concept.
Yeah. Well, as parents, it's easy to outsource various aspects of our kids' development to caring, trained adults. We have our soccer coach, we have our piano teacher, etc. And it's easy for us to think that we can similarly do the same thing with their faith and outsource their spiritual development to that youth pastor, to that small group leader, children's leader, etc. But the best research shows, if you look across studies, the best research shows that really the number one factor in a young person's faith development is their own parents' faith.
Mm,
That is the number one factor, which to me as a parent is both encouraging and terrifying.
for
As I
sure.
think about my own journey with Jesus. Sure, there are a lot of other important factors that we're going to talk about today, but really, parent influence cannot be underplayed. Let me just say this though: is that there is no if then with parenting. In fact, on my prayer walk this morning, I was reflecting on that. That a lot of times we as parents we think, well, if I just do A, B, and C, then that's going to yield X, Y, and Z in my child. And especially as our kids get older, it's just so much more complicated than that. So please take that research finding with a grain of salt about the importance of parental influence. But I just got to say, across the board, parent influence by and large is number one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love what you're saying there. And that's just, let's give grace, because we all know really great parents. I mean, far better parents than I have been or will be, that their kids have taken a route that we would not choose for our kids. And so we're free will human beings. And so that happens, and we can't carry all of that. You said something earlier. I'm just going to put you on the spot on a very practical, maybe personal note. But you said just finding out this and doing the research and kind of what it takes to build this book and what you've been teaching changed how you parent your child, your youngest, I guess. What was one of the primary things that you changed along the way? Having assumed that you kind of knew what you were doing in the first place, but and that's a big assumption over here at my
Sure,
house, that I
sure,
ever know
sure,
what's going on.
totally, totally.
But what's one of the places that, like,
Yeah.
you very intentionally switch things around?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you even how it impacted the 40 minutes before you and I chatted today in answering that question,
Great.
Cynthia. So, and to clarify, I mean, our research has impacted how we've parented all three of our kids. It's just that our youngest was 6 at the time, and
Yeah,
it
yeah.
impacted her as well as 9 and 11 were the siblings at the time. So I'll brag for a moment. My 17-year-old and my husband, Krista, and my husband Dave, they just hiked Half Dome yesterday. So
Wow.
they drove to Yosemite. It's a 17-mile hike. They got back late last night. I was already asleep. I mean, like after midnight last night, I was already asleep. So, I asked Dave to wake me up when he came into our room. And so he told me a little bit about it. But Krista, on our way home yesterday, Krista said, well, Mom, if you want to talk about my trip tomorrow, can we figure out a time to make that work? Because she knows I like to process with our kids what they've experienced. So I had to look at my schedule today. I didn't want to mess with this podcast, of course. I have some other meetings at Fuller that I couldn't change. But I thought, what? I think I can change this hour-long meeting to a half hour and pick up a half hour to sit outside in our back patio and just hear Krista talk about the time in Half Dome. So sure enough, I was able to work that out with the leader that I was meeting with. We only met for half an hour, and I got that extra half an hour with Krista because of our research that's all about the power of warmth. I'm all for what you say when, and here are some tips and tricks for parenting. I'm all for parenting hacks, absolutely. But really, one of the most important principles in the best research on parenting is that it boils down to your relationship with your child. And do you have a warm relationship with them?
Mm,
And let me just say that in the midst of the hecticness of family life, it's easy to get cursory. It's easy to get a little terse. And our family, especially with the way I think about life, it's easy to get riveted on logistics.
Yeah.
And how do we get who, when, and what do they have due, and is that permission slip signed and turned in, and you got to print that PDF, and all that sort of stuff that's part of family life today. But is there that warm relationship that we have with our kids? Are we taking the time in the midst of a busy Monday workday to carve out 30 minutes to hear about Half Dome? Because my
Mm.
daughter's not going to be home tonight. And so she knew that if we were going to talk, it needed to happen today. Perhaps hauntingly for parents is what's most important is not if we think our relationship with our kids is warm and loving and supportive, but if they think it is. So
Mm.
much of the best research on parenting is about the kid's perception, not the parent's perception. And so periodically I'll ask my kids, like, how do you feel about our relationship? What could we be doing differently that would help us be closer together? Or just recently I asked my 14-year-old, because I've had to do a lot of work lately and she's seen me on my laptop a lot. I asked her, I said, Jessica, do you feel like, how do you feel about how I'm working? Am I working too much on my laptop? And she's like, no, mom, it's totally fine. But it's her perception, not my perception of my work, but
Yeah.
her perception of my work. And so, for all of us, let's start by prioritizing those moments when we look into our kids' eyes, when we get to hear about their day, when we get to ask that follow-up question that goes a step deeper. That's really central to sticky faith parenting.
Yeah. And I think that's good because when you talk about warmth, it'd be easy to say, well, what does being warm necessarily have to do with our faith? But and maybe I'm just a slow study, but I like how you're bridging that in. And I think what you're saying also is like we've got to earn the right to be able to speak into the harder places. And if we don't have that communication, if we don't have that position or posture with our children, irrespective of what we think it is, it's what they think it is, then they probably aren't going to really hear us speak into the bigger, more important issues of faith. Does that sound
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's absolutely true.
So you talk in the book about these sticky faith conversations and how important it is to have conversations with our kids about their doubts, about different areas of the faith. But really, even before you get there, because we can all get daunted and be like, ooh, they're going to ask me, why do bad things
Yeah.
happen to good people? Or, one of
Yeah.
those. Yes. And we worry about that. But I love that you talk about just talk about your faith to them. That's one of the big pivotal things. And
Yeah.
and listen, if you have younger kids, it's very easy to start implementing that now. You just talk about
Totally.
Jesus and God, he made this and I think a lot of us do well at that. It gets harder as they get older, I will say. And as a person who talks a lot of parenting, I struggle with that sometimes in our house. And it's interesting, and people who listen to our podcast know this, but I interviewed Sadie Robertson one time, and she said the number one thing that her mom and dad did is whenever she went to her parents with a problem, they always met her with Jesus. And that's changed how
Wow.
I parent. And so when my kids come to me, I just even when it would be easy for me to be like, this is not a big deal. Here's my thoughts. But going back, not even I don't even have a scripture reference, but going back and just saying, like, I don't know, where do you think the Lord is in this? What do you think he's trying to do? And some of that stuff is hard, but how important is it that we really just go back and let them see how our faith implicates every decision?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a PhD student whose whole focus was parent-child faith conversations in our sticky faith research. And what was fascinating, what she found is it's a good thing for us as parents to do what we tend to do, say on the car ride home from church, or if we're having a conversation with our kids, and ask our kids questions. It's natural for us as parents, let's say as we're driving home in the minivan, to say, "Hey, what did you talk about? What did you learn? How was church?" What our research shows is please keep doing that. But what is as important and much less practiced is that we as parents share about our own faith journey. And we share about how God has met us. So
Mm.
there was a youth pastor who was intrigued by this research. So he had 20 kids on a short term mission trip. So these were pretty involved in the church kids. Do you know how your parents became Christians? And zero of the 20 knew how their parents became Christians.
Mm.
And when I heard that from that youth pastor, I thought, I wonder if my kids know. And so sure enough, that week I looked for an opportunity to tell them. And so, the good news is we don't have to pretend to be more spiritual than we are. We just need to share with our kids the spirituality that we have.
Yeah.
If you're in the car with your kids and a worship song comes on that you really like, pause that song for a moment and say, gosh, I love this song. It really helped me when, your stepdad and I were struggling financially. And this song and with the fact that we could trust in God, it changed my whole attitude. And then boom, resume the song. So there's just, when your kids see you pray, this is something that I've changed is I like to pray in the morning and I have this whole, journal that I do. And I used to think, well, it's great that my kids are seeing me pray, which is absolutely true. But because of our research on parent-child faith conversations, I've also started saying to my kids, hey, can I show you the page where I'm praying for you? Because, I pray for my kids spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, and relationally every day. But before our research, I wasn't telling my kids that I was praying that way for them. And so, again, you don't have to manufacture spirituality, just share the spirituality you have with your kids.
Hey guys, it's Cynthia jumping in here for just a minute. I know you're enjoying Dr. Powell, and I just wanted to say how much I love what she's talking about here in praying for our kids. And I love that even the research backs it up that when we pray for our kids, not just praying for them, but that we go back and show them the places we've prayed for them and how the Lord has been faithful. What a difference that makes in their sticky faith. So I just want to encourage you again, if you haven't grabbed a copy of my new prayer journal, get a copy. We're about to kick it off and start praying each week of the school year for our kids together. And there's each week an opportunity to pray a different attribute of our faith over our kids, but a little place to journal, to make notes. And it's a great opportunity to do that for your kids. And at the end of the school year, even be able to go back and say, hey, listen, on the week of September, whatever, I was praying this for you, and look how God's been faithful. So join me in this as we're praying for our kids. I'm passionate about that. Go to pardonthemess.org/prayer. Grab your copy of the prayer journal. We'll get it right out to you and we'll start praying through the school year for our kids. All right, back to Kara. And what a relief, right? We don't all have to be seminary trained, thank goodness, in order to talk to our kids about it. But good news, you can't be wrong. When you're telling your own story and how the Lord has impacted your life, there's no way to be wrong in that. And so, although, heck, if anybody's going to find a way to call us out as wrong, it might be our teenagers.
I was going to say, it could be our teenagers. Yeah, they have quite a lot of skill. Well, and then I've got to say, Cynthia, you said something really important. You used the word grace as you were talking a few minutes ago. And, sticky faith also means showing our kids grace and becoming a household of grace. That was one of the interesting findings, is that for so many kids who grow up in church, they think of faith like a list of behaviors, what Dallas Willard calls the gospel of sin management. And so, almost like a jacket that they wear that's only external, it's only about behaviors. And then the problem is when they toss that jacket into the into the corner, then they feel like they've moved so far away from faith, and then they end up running from God and the church just when they need God and the church the most. And so, part of what we want to do is reclaim that heart of grace that really is what separates Christianity from every other religion. Every other religion that I've studied, there's a works mentality. Grace is the unique aspect of Christianity that we want our families to marinate in. And so, so I would say, if your kid catches you do something wrong, man, apologize. And let I'm sorry and I forgive you be phrases that are pervasive in your home. We did some research on exemplar parents who are especially good at instilling sticky faith in their kids. And I remember calling one dad, and it was just as we were seeing the importance of apologizing to our kids and all that. And I remember calling one dad who had a high school daughter and 2 college-age daughters. And I said, is now a good time for us to do the 45-minute interview? And he said, well, I don't know if I'm really qualified. I've apologized to all 3 of my daughters in the last 72 hours. And again, we had seen this theme in the research already. And so I said, oh, that's exactly why I want to talk to you. If you're the kind of parent who's apologizing to your kids, which I do all the time in our family, then you're helping create that environment of grace to permeate your home, as well as remind them of the grace of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that goes back to your earlier point of just having a warm relationship with your kids. That feeds back into that warmth because they know you're willing to admit where you're flawed, where you're missing the boat. And again, people need to read the book. It's so good, but it also talks about being honest with your kids about the doubts that you have in your faith, which is another great sticky conversation. And I think that some of us can be nervous about that. Like, well, they may not already be thinking it. I hate to plant that. Or maybe they bring it to you, some of those things. And instead of saying, well, yeah, that is a hard one, we want to answer it away. But, God's big enough to answer on our behalf. He doesn't need us to make
Yeah,
excuses for him. But second
yeah.
of all, just being able to say that, yeah, I struggle with that too. That's hard. I don't understand. I don't know why God didn't answer that prayer. Those are the things that you seem to indicate also that those feed into the sticky faith because when you're not there and they have the doubts, they remember it.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Cynthia. Yeah, of all of our research findings, the role of doubt in a young person's faith formation has been one of the biggest surprises. In fact, when people ask me what surprised you about sticky faith, this is often what I talk about. What we found is that when young people have doubts, when they have the opportunity to explore and express those doubts, that's actually correlated with greater faith maturity. Or put
Mm,
more simply, it's not doubt that is toxic to faith, it's silence that is toxic to faith.
mm.
That when the young people have a chance to talk over with a caring, thoughtful adult their questions, then that can actually help them cling closer to Jesus. And so, to get a sense for your kids' doubt, one question that I like asking my kids is if you could ask God any question, what would it be? That can give you a sense of what they're thinking about and whether or not they have questions about suffering and the role of evil, or whether they're cruising along and doing just fine.
Yeah.
And when your kid asks you a tough question that you can't answer, note I said when, not if. When your kid asks you a tough question that you can't answer, I encourage you to use this 4-word phrase that has been game changing for me, and parents that we've taught it to. And that 4-word phrase is, I don't know, but. So, when your young person asks you a tough question, you follow up with, well, I don't know. But why don't you and I, let's get together in another couple days and talk about it? Or I don't know, but I'll tell you, I know a scientist at our church who loves questions like that. Let's talk to her and see
Yeah.
what she can say. Or I don't know, but here's what I have found true about God, and here how God has changed my life. You can make it a little bit more personal. So, saying I don't know, but honors the question, and then can either suggest a next step that you take to continue the conversation, or can point them to what you have found to be true about God.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's a good word for all of us. And so you also go on to talk about kind of just the different kinds of sticky relationships. We're not going to go into all of that. There's so much for people to read. It's so good. But one thing that I thought was very interesting when y'all talked about church and worship and relationships within the church. And I thought this was such a good thing to know for all. It's just a practical insight. And you talked a little bit, and I'll let you kind of complete it, but about everybody kind of wants that silver bullet of what it is for sticky faith and in the
Yeah.
context of attendance in church and worship.
Yeah.
Will you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, sure. We all kind of would like to know, those of us who are involved in churches, like what's the most important thing that a church can do? And to be honest, our research didn't fully answer that question. We don't necessarily have a silver bullet, but we do have silver shavings, because we looked at 13 different youth group participation variables, 13 things that kids tend to do in the context of youth group. And you'll be glad to know that studying scripture was correlated with mature faith in high school and college.
Oh,
Being
good.
involved in service and justice work, which we see young people doing in droves, and it's wonderful. That's correlated with mature faith in high school, college. But of everything that we looked at, the variable that was most correlated with mature faith in high school and college was intergenerational relationships.
Mm,
Not having the children's ministry or the youth ministry kind of off on its own, doing its own thing all the time, but figuring out, how can we involve young people in the life of the church, and how can our young people have specific mentors? So, in our family, we've talked a lot about who's on your team, and specifically out of our sticky faith research, we talk about a 5-to-1 ratio, which actually comes from Chap Clark, the co-author of the Sticky Faith book with me, where he says, the typical children's ministry, youth ministry, we talk about we want one adult for every 5 kids, say in small groups or Sunday school, next winter retreat, whatever it might be. And out of our research, and what Chap says is, what if we reverse that and have 5 adults investing in each young person? And I'm not talking about 5 Bible study leaders. I'm talking about 5 adults who are on your kids' team, as I said, is phrasing that we use in our family, who are praying for your kids, who are that safe place that
mm,
your kids can go when they don't feel like they can talk to you. They can go to those other adults. And so, the good news for us as parents is we're not alone. there are other adults who can step in and help fill those gaps that, for whatever reason we can't fill. And if creating 5 relationships feels overwhelming to you, here's the good news: you don't actually have to create the relationships. Odds are good that your child already has some potential relationships, that if you could click, turn the dial on the intentionality of those relationships. It's that senior adult they run up and give a hug to every time they're at church. It's that coach who they seem to gravitate toward. It's that small group leader at church who really means a lot to them. The good news is your child is probably in one or more of these relationships already. And so what we want to do as parents is just make sure that those relationships are as generative and safe and connected as possible. So that's a great place to focus some of your energy, is not just on your own relationship with your kid, but what adults, when your kid has their next recital, or when your kid has their next basketball game, what adult or 2 or 3 can you invite to go and to be there in the stands cheering for them and really show that they're part of your kid's team.
That's good. That's practical, and it's doable for all of us. It really is. And so, as we kind of wrap up, if someone's listening and they have the younger side of kids and they're thinking, okay, what can I implement? What can I do different tomorrow than I did today based on the research and kind of some of your recommendations, but just what we know about sticky faith? What would you tell someone? Like, start here. And some of this we've talked about, but what would you say to, I mean, I'm going to ask you the older kids too, but if you have a younger kid, what's a starting point today?
Great, great. And I'm going to repeat things that we've already talked about because we have already talked about the most foundational things. I think, Cynthia, when you and I were talking about just talking about Jesus with your kids, so it's natural.
Yeah.
The best time to do that is when your kids are young. Because they're more open, they're less jaded, they're more connected to you.
Sure.
You as a parent are less hokey and nerdy and all that we often become as we get older and our kids get older. So that's what I would say, is just make talking about Jesus as much a part of your regular vocabulary and regular conversations as possible.
I love that. It reminded me, before I ask you the counterpart to that question, it reminded me when my kids were little, I'm sure yours did this too. Like in the car, like we talked about earlier, we'd always say to them, like, what'd you learn at church? And when they were little, like 2 and 3, it was always just Jesus. I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
that's not the
totally,
answer to
totally,
everything. So
totally.
what did you have to eat? What was your snack at church today? Jesus. Oh, okay. Well, cool. We've done
Yeah,
something right, clearly over here. But
totally. That's hilarious.
okay, so I love that. And then for those of us that have older kids, or like myself, I'm looking at another year with them. What would be your best recommendation of sticky faith? What are we gonna work towards now?
It's creating that team around them. That's not just you, but it's, a favorite aunt, a favorite teacher, small group leader, mentor, fellow congregant at your church, neighbor, whoever it might be, creating that team so that, when they graduate from high school, whether they go to college, military, the workforce, they know that they have a whole safety net. That's not just you, but these other caring adults. And if I could just end with one story,
Sure.
when it comes to building this team of adults, Dave and I, we've thought a lot about that with our kids. And, when they turned 13, we did a ritual to really instill these 5 adults into their life. And then we've only had one who graduated from high school, but when he graduated from high school, we did something else that was a prayer time. But when he turned 18, we got this volleyball, just a plain white volleyball off Amazon. And all of our kids play volleyball. They're tall and athletic and not particularly aggressive. So volleyball's perfect because you never touch the
Yes.
other team. So
Yes.
they do much better at volleyball than basketball, for instance, where their height helps, but they got to touch the other team. So anyway, all 3 of our kids play volleyball. And so we got this volleyball for Nathan, and we drove it around basically Los Angeles and asked all the adults who've invested in his life to sign that volleyball. And far more than 5. This was a broader net, and it included relatives, it included people who've been in our intergenerational small groups with our kids, pastors, etc. They didn't have to write anything other than their name, because we wanted Nathan to take that volleyball with him to college. He left California, where we live, to go to college, and we wanted him to have this volleyball on the $6 stand I bought from Amazon as a constant reminder of the adults in his life. So sure enough, this last freshman year, he's had that volleyball. It's been on his windowsill. It shows him every day the adults who are cheering for him, even when he's in a whole other state at college. So because of the pandemic, his school actually ended up canceling or moving the rest of the semester online while he was on spring break, while everybody was on spring break. And so the college said, don't come back for your stuff. We will pack up all your stuff. And so my son has a pretty simple life. He's got, t-shirts and sweatshirts and books, and that's about it.
Yeah, boys.
And yeah, exactly. And as we were talking about the packing up process at his school, he said, well, there's nothing that important that I really care about all that much, that they could mess up. He said, other than the volleyball. And I thought, yeah, I'm tearing up even as I say that. Like, yeah, Nathan, other than that volleyball. And so, it doesn't have to be a volleyball. It could be a t-shirt. It can be a musical score, whatever. But look for ways to tangibly remind your teenage kids that there's a whole team of adults cheering for them, whether that team is 3 people or 13 people. They're not alone. They have you as a parent, but then they also have this wonderful safety net. So that's kind of the recent positive example of teen out of our family. So.
I love that. I love that. And so what I love about this book, Sticky Faith, Everyday Ideas to Build Lasting Faith in Your Kids, is that it just helps you with intentionality, and it's so doable, but just having the right conversations that along the way, not even the right, just having conversations and putting relationships in place. We didn't even mention today, but about sticky justice, kind of the bridge out of the home. There's so much in this. And so it's a great reminder on the things we do and the role we serve as parents. And that, like we said earlier, there's no guarantee with our kids. At the end of the day, God set it up where they get to make the choice in their faith. But if we can do the little things and usher them in the right direction, then I think we're doing our job.
Absolutely. At least we know we're being faithful.
That's exactly right. Well, Kara, thanks for spending a few minutes with me.
Oh, my pleasure, Cynthia. You asked great questions. I really enjoyed this conversation.
You're sweet. Well, I will link the book and podcast notes, everybody, to make sure you can find it and grab your copy. It's in all the usual places, I assume.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's Amazon, or you can also go to foleyyouthinstitute.org, and you can get not just the book, but a host of other Sticky Faith resources for your family or for your church.
All right. I enjoyed talking to Kara. I think Sticky Faith is such a cool concept. And again, no guarantees anything we do will necessarily lead to an end result with our kids. But I love that there's practical things to do when they're younger, really just feeding into that warm relationship with them, talking out the Lord. And as they get older, again, placing relationships around them is so critical. Be sure when you grab a copy of the book to read the section talking about how important it is to worship together intergenerationally. There's just a lot of great thoughts. So I hope you enjoyed our chat with Kara. Don't forget to order a prayer journal, and we'll start praying together right after Labor Day. pardonthemess.org/prayer. Again, pardonthemess.org/prayer. It's linked in the podcast notes. You guys, we know your days are busy, so as always, thank you for joining us as we pardon the mess.